Hello everyone, welcome to my latest interview. I think this is turning into a bit of a series. I probably need a proper name for it. For anyone who doesn't know, I am Katie Montgomery. I'm an internet dickhead who argues about trans rights, and I'm a trans woman. And today I am talking to Jo Maugham from Good Law Project. Hi Jo. For anyone who doesn't know who you are, would you like to just briefly introduce yourself?
Hi, Katie, and hi, everyone. Yes, I am a lawyer. So I was a Queen's Counsel sort of senior trial lawyer. I used to argue tax cases, and I realized that actually there were more useful and interesting things I could do with my life. So in 2016, I
More
started.
interesting than tax, gosh.
Well, you probably don't want to get started on that conversation. Tax can be interesting.
No, quick, sorry,
I think
carry
this
on.
is I always get that reaction when I offer that blanket. So yeah, 2016, I started the Law Project. We began litigating mostly on cases around governance around Brexit. So we brought a whole series of cases that kept Parliament's options open during the Brexit process. And then we hired our first person in beginning of 2020. We've grown very, very quickly over the last few years. So we now litigate in three strands of work. One is about sort of the rule of law and good governance. One is about the environment, and one is about communities that are getting stiffed by the media. That would be you. Um, and the trans rights work we do falls into that last category.
Yeah. So that's why we've got you here today to discuss what's going on and hopefully build some like optimism about the future, because things in the UK have been scary for trans people for the last 6 or so years, particularly. But so that's also for everyone watching. Just below here, you can see this donation target and some comments and stuff. If you would like to donate to Good Law Project because you hear what they're doing over the course of this show, then please do donate below. They're like building up a, I don't know what the word for it is, like a sum of money to take several pro-trans rights cases to court. And this money is, correct me if I'm wrong, Jo, but this money is just for the trans rights stuff. So you're not going to be siphoning any of this off to go and fight Boris or anything.
That is absolutely true. We get a few emails from people. So we have a lot of regular givers. We have about 30,000 people who give us money every month. And then we crowdfund for individual bits of litigation. I'm pretty sure that institutionally, the amount of time it takes us to do the work on trans rights is such that it's subsidized rather than subsidizing other areas of our work.
So yeah, anyone who would like to donate to that, the link is just in the description below, or you can go onto Crowd Justice and look for Good Law Project Trans and Google that. So that, I guess one of the first things I wanted to say about that before we get into like your history and how you got here and stuff is this number seems like a huge number, and I think lots of trans people are worth seeing, used to seeing like crowdfunders for trans healthcare, which is big numbers. You know, sometimes people need $100,000 or something, but that seems like an incredible sum of money. And then to see this maybe starting at 181, you might think like, oh, why do they need any more money? But I guess what we will be covering is how many cases you've done, and you know much better than I do, but law is very expensive and very time consuming. So perhaps this sum here will seem more reasonable to you as we go through. I hope so anyway. But yeah, so I guess going back in history a bit, the first time I was aware of you was actually is when the gender criticals were first sort of starting to get a bit more mainstream and starting to get big news in the like in the newspapers and stuff, which maybe 2016, or maybe it was a little later than that. But they had this crowdfunder to sue Labour, I don't know if sue's the right word, take them to court over their all-women shortlists, because Labour announced, oh, trans women can be on these all-women shortlists. And you must have been high profile enough to get shown to me on Twitter as someone who had donated to the gender critical cause to get that reviewed rather than to like like a trans cause. So that's the case, right?
That is the case. So,
What changed your
I'm
mind,
being
or
on
have you changed your mind?
Yeah, well, I mean, what initially changed my mind? So this was a crowdfunder about, as you say, about whether trans women could be on women's only shortlists without a gender recognition certificate, and that was fundamentally the point. And I think, like lots of people who come to an issue fresh, what was in my mind at the time was that it was wrong that something that had been created, this post of, I mean, it wasn't just to be on women's only shortlist. In fact, it was to be a woman's officer in various bits of the Labour Party. Whether that space that had been created for women in the Labour Party, which has a big problem with women, should be available to people who self-ID'd. And at the time, I thought that it shouldn't. And I think two things happened, really. In the immediate aftermath of my saying that, lots of people pointed out to me that if you read the rest of the crowdfunding page, it contained some really quite horrid stuff about trans people that went much further than that relatively narrow question about whether you could self-ID to be a women's officer. And once I had seen that, I'd clumsily not read the whole page. I
think that's
I said that I couldn't support that stuff, and so I pulled out. But perhaps more interesting was what happened longer term. And I guess I became just a bit more thoughtful about two things. One is what it is to be a woman. And the most articulate person I've heard on this subject actually is Nancy Kelly, who's the chief executive of Stonewall. And she talks about how her own interest in trans rights she came at through the perspective of Black feminism, women of colour, who described their frustration at having their feminism approved of or disapproved of by women whose experience of the world is very different, and in particular of middle class, often middle class white women who Black feminists felt excluded them. And she said that once she saw how there was a sort of very dominant strand of feminist thought that sometimes could exclude others, she became interested in other women who that strand of feminism excluded, including trans women. So that was one thing. And the other thing that happened really was that I became more thoughtful about whether really it was a thing that would actually happen. Right. Would anybody actually be so desperate to get a post in the Labour Party that they would self-ID, a man would self-ID as a woman in order to win a post, some sort of minor official post of the Labour Party? And that just seemed to me, as soon as you asked the question, not in the abstract, but in the reality, it just became clear that it was a purely hypothetical problem that was being weighed heavily against real life actual problems for trans women. And that point really is the point that completely dominates our discourse even today. I think it's this conflict between the theoretical and the actual.
Yeah, and I think a good example of that I saw recently, so perhaps we'll get onto this later, but there was a case for women, Fair Play for Women, there's so many gender critical groups. Fair Play for Women tried to get the Scottish government to change the guidance on their census. So Scotland's got their census coming up, and part of it is you tick whether you're male or female, and they wanted the guidance to say tick whether you think you're male or female, and the gender criticals wanted to say only tick, if you're a trans person, only tick differently to your birth sex if you've got a gender recognition certificate. And the case ruled in favour of trans people, and so now you can put the right value for you in that box. I mean, people did that anyway, but and one of the replies to that was, so for the first time ever, every single 100% of Scottish people are going to be female, and it's going to ruin all the statistics. And it's like, this is such a theoretical, ridiculous situation, as if every single Scottish person is going to tick female. Like, it's just so ridiculous. And you're comparing that to, like you say, the real world situation, and just pretending that this sort of theoretical, I mean, it technically is theoretically possible that every single person could tick female, but why would they? It just doesn't make any sense. But I think that when it comes to this this shortlist thing, there's kind of two sides. How I always explain it to people. One is like, why would anyone do that? And the other is, I think a lot of people don't realize how ridiculous the gender recognition certificate process is for the UK. And I only just recently, like 2 weeks ago, got my gender recognition certificate. And I've been living, this has been, me living like this has been my life for like 7 years or whatever. And why only 2 weeks ago should I have been able to run for a Labour women's officer? Whereas 3 weeks ago, I wouldn't have been able to. Like, that's not a sensible process. And this is someone who comparatively has quite an easy ride as far as legal stuff goes, like you mentioned about middle-class white women. That's me, and that makes things easier. I'm quite a typical case in transition and stuff, and it's still taken me all this time to get one of these stupid certificates that only like 1% of trans people in the country have. So it's just such it's these two things of, it's a theoretical thing versus a real life thing. And so
and the census story also tells us, doesn't it, a little bit about how this stuff has become so weaponized. A couple of years ago, it was hilarious when people were putting down Jedi on their census in response to the question, what religion are you? And no one really cared about that, despite the fact that there was quite a lot of evidence that people were actually doing it as an actual joke. And here, there is substantially no evidence, none that I'm aware of at all, in fact, that people are deliberately trying to skew the census figures by putting down the gender which is not their real gender on the census. And yet, there's been litigation in England, and there's been litigation in Scotland, and it's both cases have been very expensive, and one has succeeded and one has failed in relation to a completely illusory problem. Meanwhile, actual problems for women in a heavily patriarchal society, riven with real violence from real cis men directed at women, be they trans women or cis women, is ever present. And that's the great mystery of it for me. Why has it become such a red button issue?
It's definitely become like the culture war thing. I always describe it as the trans panic, like as in taking the name from the satanic panic, which also then, like, the second version of that was the gay panic. And it's like every generation, I guess, picks one thing and the media blows it completely out of proportion, and it becomes the culture war issue, and you need to have an opinion on it. And suddenly every single person in the UK has an opinion about how easy it should be for me to get a certificate so I can get married. Like, why? It's just completely ridiculous. But people, it's something that's new in like cultural awareness. And then it's also because like trans people existing and their rights is like an affront to the patriarchy, that then becomes an issue. It's the thing they can all talk about to radicalize people to being bigoted and supporting loads of attacks on women. I won't rant off onto this too much because I want to talk more about Good Law Project. So in like around 2016, I guess, is when I first started getting into following gender critical as like a thing. And since then, they've had these groups pop up, like For Women Scot, for a Fair Play for Women, LGB Alliance, like all of these gender critical groups, and lots of them and some individuals too have followed this kind of model that they did with the all women shortlist, where they make some buzz and they start a crowdfunder, and then all of the right-wing newspapers publish about it over the same week, so they get loads of publicity. Then they get donations in the region of £100,000, and then they do some court case. And quite a lot of them have been judicial reviews, which I didn't even know what that was until recently, and now I'm quite aware of it as far as law things go. But certainly as a trans person, like on the ground and watching this, I felt like that we had nothing. We were just standing there, and they were, firing all these shots at us, and lots of them failed, but some of them stuck. And I just thought, we need, like, where's our one? What's going on here? And I kind of feel like Good Law Project has taken that spot. Do you feel like it? Like, is that what? I guess, was your change of mind like the sole reason that you decided to get into trans rights stuff with Good Law Project, or did you see this kind of like really one-sided thing going on, or?
I mean, I talked about how Good Law Project's work should be shaped by personal experience. I mean, it's an incredibly difficult space to work in. I've worked in lots and lots of difficult spaces. People have started calling me up and saying, so nice to talk to public enemy number one, good to hear you. You're still alive, Jolien. I've worked in some very difficult spaces, and none of them is as difficult as this one. But I do it because I suppose I remember the kid that I was who was left voiceless. I had a very difficult childhood. I've written about it a few times. I won't talk about it now, it'll take too long. Yeah. But I remember not being heard, and I remember that being incredibly unfair. And when Biden took the presidency, Obama talked about him as turning pain into purpose. And I guess the very things, Katie, that you were talking about a minute ago struck me as well. Quite how voiceless the trans community is. Also, important to say, quite how voiceless the very substantial cis community that supports trans people is. Yeah. I mean, you would never think of it if you read the papers, but the truth is that most cis women are trans supporters. They are not gender critical. Gender critical feminism is still a minority strand of thought. And so I think it was a coming together of those things, really, a real sense of the unfairness of what was happening in our media to trans people. I've spoken about having trans, someone very important to me who's trans, and they were always in my thoughts. And I guess I thought that there was something that the law might be able to do. I think it was the coming together of those things, really, that caused me to want Good Law Project to begin to work in that space.
Well, yeah, I'm glad that you have, and we'll soon get on to some of the good stuff that you've done. I guess one of the things I wanted to mention here, saying about, cis people and trans people, and one of the things that so the trans community is quite voiceless in the UK. Like, all of the media is anti-trans, like all of it's anti-trans. That's just a fact. As far left as the Guardian and far right as, I don't know, the Times, but even more extreme sides of that is still just garbage. At best, we'll sometimes get both sides on the left wing. But then when we do see groups do something, often it is groups like Pink News. They do a lot of pro-trans articles, but they are like cis-led. And then we've got like Stonewall, who do pro-trans stuff, and they are cis-led. And it can often seem, and Mermaids are another very good organization, and they're cis-led. And I know that a lot of trans people feel like, where is our organizations that do this? And some can be quite skeptical of them, because if it's like a whole group of cis people, so you often see these debates on like Good Morning Britain or whatever, and they get a gender critical cis person and then a pro-trans rights cis person, and they have this argument and they both say stupid things, and we're all just like, so it makes people kind of nervous. But I guess that's one of the things that I liked about Good Law Project. is I know you've got like trans advisory board who sort of, I don't know, what level of control do trans people have over the Good Law Project staff?
Yeah, we have a trans advisory board that sets priorities for how we spend the money that we've raised. Everyone on that board is trans. There's one person on the board who is the parent of a trans child, so she's cis, but is there because she represents a particular constituency that's important to the work that we do. It's an important point, actually, and I think about it a lot. What does good allyship look like if you're cis? Because I cannot know how it feels to be trans in Britain at the moment, because I'm not. And I cannot bring the authenticity, the power that comes from that lived experience. And I shouldn't be debating cis people about trans rights, because there are no concessions that are mine to make. I can't say trans people are wrong to say this thing, because I'm not a trans person. On the other hand, it's also true that in a society that is transphobic and indeed is patriarchal, if you are, like me, a cis, middle-class white man, your voice is heard in places and by people who would not hear trans voices. And so really, I mean, I don't always get it right, obviously, but I try and chart a course between those two poles. There is stuff that my voice can say that will be heard, and that's important. I mean, I know this every time, right? If a trans person tweets something that I want to amplify and I retweet them, it gets modest engagement. If I don't retweet them, but I tweet their message and thank them for the point, or tweet the article that they want to amplify, it gets lots more coverage. And so, you know, all you can do really, I think all that you need to do is just to be thoughtful about how you, as I say, how you chart a course between those two poles.
Yeah, I think that's important. I know that sometimes trans people get frustrated with cis people speaking for us, and they'll say things like, "Oh, just cis people stops," and then we get all these otherwise, you know, would be great allies stepping back and being like, "This isn't my thing," and then they just stand by while we have to do all the work. So then we're like, "Can you just help?" And then loads of people are enthusiastic, step in and say a load of stupid stuff, and we're like, "Oh," but it is a constant challenge, and I think it's not just as straightforward as you know, like a cis person and the trans person, because I also have some version of this challenge in being like a having a fairly, I don't know, it's difficult to talk about, I guess, like successful, lucky transition, and being like a white woman and a middle class person and all these things. I don't also want to speak on behalf of the whole trans community, and I can't, and I can only speak on behalf of myself. But I really have to listen to those who aren't in such a privileged position as me. But also I know that the cis wider audience is going to just listen to me more than they will some trans person that they haven't, you know, got round to understanding yet. So yeah, it's definitely a balancing act of sorts. But yeah, anyway, so Good Law Project kind of got going, you said, around 2016. It's around the same time as the gender critical movement got going, but you didn't move on to trans stuff straight away. So there's a few things that you have done for trans rights, and a few that are like upcoming. So I thought we could just talk about some of those. So is it that the first like one you went for was the like first part of the Bell case about trans kids?
So we take very, very difficult cases. Yeah. And we've got a very good record, and I'll come on to talk about that in a second, because we work with the best lawyers that there are, and that's expensive. we get people to work for us at very, very low rates, actually. So somebody who might charge someone else £800 or £900 an hour will typically work for us for £150 an hour.
Wow, that's a big difference.
So we get very, very good people at very, very low rates. But doing this stuff properly takes time and it is expensive. So the first case that we took actually was a case about waiting times for trans adolescents to access puberty blockers. We took that case in November or December 2019. And we were just about to issue proceedings when the divisional court handed down its decision in the Bell case. So we paused and we put together an intervention in the Bell case in the divisional court. And the intervention was an intervention of Gendered Intelligence, which is a trans-led charity for young trans people. Brooke, which is a sexual health charity for everyone, trans and cis, that was particularly concerned about the impact of Bell on abortion rights. If adolescents can't consent to puberty blockers, then will they be able to consent to abortion?
And contraception
or contraception, that's right. And the third party to that intervention was the Endocrine Society, which is the international body of endocrinologists who prescribe hormones, all types of hormones. So, if you have hormone replacement therapy, that'll be prescribed by an endocrinologist, but they also prescribe puberty blockers and cross-sex hormones. And we put together an intervention involving the three of them. We intervened in the Bell case, and the case was overturned in the Court of Appeal. So that was the first thing we did. Meanwhile, the result of the Bell case in the divisional court was that even if you were a trans kid and adolescent who had supportive parents, and you wanted puberty blockers, and your parents wanted you to have puberty blockers, and there was a consultant who wanted to prescribe puberty blockers, you still couldn't get puberty blockers without a court order. And I thought that was absolutely bananas.
It's just prohibitive. Like, no, that's just not going to happen, is it? Like, no.
Well, it is. It's absolutely, it's prohibitive, but it's also nonsensical, because what does a court bring? What does a judge bring to a situation where child, parents, and doctor all agree on a particular course of treatment? What is the expertise that a judge is bringing to that party? And we could find no analogy in English law. So we supported a case brought by parents of a trans child. The case is called AB, saying that the Tavistock had to change its treatment protocol so that it accepted parental consent. So we won that case as well, and we won, well, at least our intervention was on the winning side in the appeal against the divisional court's decision in Bell. And then we returned to our case about waiting lists, and we've issued proceedings there.
So that's still to come.
That's still to come. And that case is about how it's unlawful and discriminatory for trans young people and for trans adults to have to wait years to access care where the NHS constitution says that they should be seen within 18 weeks. I mean, 18 years is perhaps a more realistic assessment of waiting times if you're a trans adult seeking to access care.
Yeah.
So that case is happening, and then there's a whole string of other stuff which I can talk about now.
Yeah, no, let's just pause back a bit on the Bell case and come back into that next. So, I guess for anyone who doesn't know, the Bell case was a situation where some gender criticals did their little pattern where they crowdfund a load of money, make a load of hype. Then they had a court case, and it basically stopped people under 16 from getting any trans healthcare. So puberty blockers and also cross-sex hormones, and the whole thing was just, they said kids can't consent to this. And like Joe pointed out, that it attacked a law that we have in the UK called Gillett competence, which, or I don't know if it's a law, I'm probably not using the right terms here, but it's the president or whatever, the thing that people follow is this Gillett competence thing, which is also used for abortion and contraception. And when it happened, honestly, it was one of the worst days of my life. It was so overwhelmingly horrifying. It was just before like Christmas, and I was talking, I'm friends with quite a lot of families who have trans kids, and talking to them about their kids, so some of these kids are like stealth at school, which means that their friends don't know they're trans, and they're, before being a teenager and things are lined up for them, they're just going to be able to transition and not have to deal with all the like horrors of everything, going through puberty as a trans person and all this kind of stuff, and then deal with their friends, and just to kind of have that like taken away from them from one random judge who made one crap decision. It was utterly horrifying. But the case itself, I was talking to, my crews of trans people beforehand, and we were feeling quite optimistic because, I mean, firstly, why the hell is the law and the state getting involved in expert, internationally recommended healthcare at all? Like, why is that a thing? But also just because the original case was so rubbish. I mean, they had a load of anti-trans hate groups in there giving evidence, and like no like opposing pro-trans groups, or very few. And all the people who were like giving evidence, they weren't experts, they weren't, like they had Transgender Trend in there, which is some gender critical group, and they have absolutely nothing going for them. Like, they're not experts, they're not people who work with trans kids, they just know absolutely nothing, and somehow they were given permission to be there. And yeah, I don't know, it was just so amazing. I don't know if you feel like that was, or whether you can say whether it was like a terrible mistake, or it was even like a gender critical judge trying to like, I don't know, it was very shocking for a number of reasons.
Yeah, I mean, I was also shocked by that decision. I spoke about it to Grace Lavery, who's a professor at Berkeley in the States, who's trans, and I gave an interview to her about it all. And it's worth reading that interview. I was referred to my professional regulator by a BBC journalist in relation to it, and I was only recently cleared for giving that interview because I was very caustic about that decision. I mean, I was shocked. I was really, really shocked that the divisional court did not have a single voice before it for the trans community when it made this decision, that it turned into a sort of de facto inquiry into trans healthcare. Not one single trans voice was represented before the divisional court, and the decision was truly, truly awful. It's very, very difficult to understand how a neutral court could have come to that decision. I made all of these points to Professor Lavery before the Court of Appeal strongly overturned the divisional court decision. I was very relieved that it did. Otherwise, I'd probably be in some trouble. But look, this is what privilege looks like, right? If you have a platform, if you're a QC, a Queen's Counsel, if you have the authority to say that things are very, very wrong, it's important that you do, because nobody else can.
Yeah.
Nobody else can be heard. Nobody else will say these things in ways that will resonate. And if you really care about issues, I think it's really important that you speak out when the law gets stuff so profoundly wrong. It's incredibly damaging still, that Bell decision. It was cited in Texas just a couple of days ago.
Some just been cited in Sweden's just done a review. One of their top public health organizations has just basically advised that no one prescribes any trans healthcare for trans kids, and they've cited amongst other things, but they've cited the original Bell case ruling, but not like the repeal, and then also Dr. Lippman's ROGD study, and it's like, it's still causing damage internationally. I think every single like attack on trans healthcare for adolescents since then has cited it. The ones not just in Texas, but like half of the USA, like half of the states, in Australia as well. So it was very damaging, and I think that's kind of the scary thing about, or how I feel about trans rights, is that there's all these court cases constantly just coming up. There's a new gender critical one, sometimes two days in a row we recently had, and every single one is likely to not be a problem. Like there was one a while ago when the Authentic Equality Alliance, which is some gender critical group, tried to argue that trans women, the EHRC guidance, we'll get onto the EHRC in a bit, the EHRC guidance said that trans women count as women in all situations, and you can't ban them from spaces, and they wanted to get that guidance changed. And of course the judge said, well, this is nonsense, that's not what the law says, go away. But the thing is, there's so many of these cases, and they're all kind of rubbish, like that one, but it only takes one, like the Bell case, to just get through, and suddenly our rights change. Like it could be that I wake up one day and my rights are different to the day before because of some low-level judge somewhere, not even like the Supreme Court or whatever, but just some judge has made a decision, and suddenly, like, maybe it's legal to ban trans women from the pub toilets or something, or maybe the census has changed and all these kinds of things, and it's just really scary. I don't it's not a good system, in my opinion, and I'm glad that you're fighting back within the rules of it. But the idea that some judge can make a decision and suddenly take healthcare away from hundreds of children is just horrifying, really. But yeah, so like moving on to the next thing. So yeah, there was like two parts to the Bell case. There was your initial the one with the parental consent, and then you managed to appeal the whole thing. And like when that happened, like it was a very good day. I felt like as soon as that ruling came out, I was like, right, I'm getting drunk this evening. It's gonna be a good it was a good time. And it was interesting watching the difference in reaction when the original ruling came out, that the entire trans community in the UK was devastated. Like people were, I knew people who just went home from work ill because they just couldn't handle it. Families having to tell their children. Like I had people message me being like, "How am I going to tell my daughter this? Like I just can't do it." There was such a universal dread. And when when it got repealed or to overturned or whatever the word is, the gender criticals were just like, oh, damn. Anyway, onward to the next one, and it just felt so unbalanced. That there's not much at stake, if anything, other than their money for lots of these people, most of them. And
that's a really important point, isn't it? Because you have no choice about whether you engage with this stuff that's happening in civil society. If you're trans, for you it's existential.
Yeah.
Whereas even on the sort of worst case assessments of gender critical people, the damage, in inverted commas, that self-ID for trans women will do is a drop in the bucket of the violence, and in particular sexual violence, that is perpetrated on all women by cis men. So it's the level of interest, the level of engagement is completely unbalanced. There is so little at stake for those women, even on their own worst case assessments. I really struggle to understand why we are arguing about this.
Yeah, I mean, it's just an irrational panic that's turned into a profitable, it's a conspiracy theory, and in some places it's a cult, and also it's profitable. Like, some of these people are professional gender criticals now, and lots of these lawyers, I mean, some of these law firms from gender critical people have raked in like £500,000. And so it's in their benefit to carry on suggesting these cases. So saying that, talking to a lawyer who are crowdfunding for, but you know, it shows the balance here, because if they lose the cases, then whatever. Whereas if I lose them, potentially it's, you know, my rights on the line. But yeah, anyway, so then you've got this thing on the waiting times, and you mentioned, you know, there's ridiculous waiting times, but there's a few more things coming up, and I think people. Yeah, let's talk about the LGBT Alliance one. Basically, there's a lot of gender critical groups, but LGBT Alliance are one of the most ridiculous, incompetent, plainly garbage groups, and somehow they managed to get charity status, which I feel like it would be difficult for me to not describe whatever led to that as corruption. I not at all putting that on you saying that. That's just what I feel like, because it is so utterly ridiculous. Like, they're so transparently just an anti-trans group. But anyway, so you've got this case coming up to challenge?
So, yeah. I mean, I was accosted at a party, actually, by one of the founders of LGBA a couple of weeks ago. I was there with a friend of mine who, I won't name her, when one of the founders of LGBA came over, and she said, I used to love all of your work, and I just don't understand why you're doing this against us. We're just protecting the rights of women, and in particular lesbian women. You don't seem to be interested in what this means for lesbian women. And the woman that I was with jumped in and said, well, I'm a lesbian woman, and I think this is completely consistent with my understanding of what it is to be a lesbian woman. And bizarrely, I mean, I hadn't even known she was lesbian, so I was very, very grateful to her for throwing herself in front of that particular bus. But yeah, they're very media savvy. They seem to have enormous amounts of money. We know that vast amounts of money are coming into the UK from the Christian right. We don't know where that money is going, but it must be going somewhere. And if it isn't going in part to many of these crowdfunders and many of these organizations that seem to spring up out of nowhere with very professional offers, I'd be pretty amazed. I had this discussion actually with the LGBA founder, and she said, well, no, all of our money comes from members of the public. And I said, well, how do you know? Because you don't know who is giving you money. Even if money comes into your crowdfunder, people have the option of telling you who they are.
It's self-ID, isn't it?
It's self-ID, that's right. And so you just have no way of knowing, in truth, whether the money is being fed in dribs and drabs from some huge Christian right organisation in the States, or from somebody who's genuinely concerned in the UK.
There was one ages ago, because some, as well as these big like attacks on law, there's been like lots of different defamation and stuff cases going on around this as well. And there's also been cases about police misconduct. There's been lots of different things, and I can't remember exactly what it was, and I'm not going to say who it was, but a gender critical person had some law trouble and they needed money for some case. And they originally had it go against them, then they appealed it and it went for them, and then they didn't have any trouble. But in that thing, they people were accusing them of taking money from the religious right and stuff, because that's the accusation that gender criticals always get. And she was like, kind of like accidentally mask off, said, you know what? I did have a religious right organisation come and say that they'd pay all of my fees and we wouldn't have to, and I turned them down. So if anyone says we're being funded by the right, they're lying. And I was like, yeah, but they wouldn't have come to me and offered me the money, would they? They did offer you.
Well, so all the other people who, there'll be lots of people around who have had that same offer and who haven't said no.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, undoubtedly, there is a huge avalanche of money from the Christian right coming into the UK and Europe. There's report after report after report that identifies that the number is in the billions of pounds. And, the trans community in the UK does not have much support in the establishment. As you rightly point out, it's very, very difficult to get any newspaper to give trans people any sort of a hearing, let alone a reasonable and sustained one.
Do we have any trans QCs in the country that are out as trans, or any trans?
Well, I'm not sure that I'd know, to be honest. There are a couple of trans barristers that I'm aware of. There are very, very few QCs who are out as trans supporting, let alone known to be trans.
So obviously it would be difficult to come out, but I guess the point is, we don't have any openly trans politicians, we don't have any openly trans editors of newspapers, and there are very few trans journalists and very few trans barristers and lawyers, and we don't have the institutional power. And for sure we have some trans allies, but there are so many gender critical people in these positions of power and people who are sympathetic to their views. So you've got some case coming up to, I don't quite understand how you can challenge the charity status with the law, but
to become a charity you have to meet certain legal thresholds. And those thresholds are about determining which groups exist fundamentally for the public good. And the question really is whether LGBA exists for the public good, or is it a hate group? And I think it's a hate group, and there is a lot of evidence that it's a hate group. I'm very happy to say that here, as I've said it elsewhere, the LGB is a hate group. It does very little that does not involve the pumping out of transphobic material, and some of it is quite revolting. They have compared being trans to being sexually interested in animals. Yeah. I mean, it's really, really, really horrid stuff, and all of this stuff will go before the tribunal that hears challenges to charitable status. It's a very difficult challenge because of a technical point around standing. The challenge is actually being brought by mermaids, and the law seems to be that there are very narrow grounds upon which anyone can challenge the standing of a charity. We may need to appeal, and we will appeal if we lose the first instance, the finding that a finding that mermaids doesn't have standing. I mean, it's obviously a decision for mermaids for us.
Yeah, this was something I was going to ask about. I saw recently about standing, and that's something I only just heard about from Good Law Project, because you had some ruling saying you didn't have standing in some case. Is that this case, or is that another case?
No, that's a different case. There's a concept that's very familiar to lawyers, that you have to have a sufficient interest in an issue before you can bring a challenge to it. And a court held in relation to a challenge to the failure of government to take into account the impacts of its recruitment policies on disabled people and ethnic minorities, that the Runnymede Trust did have standing. Runnymede was our co-claimant, and because it was a better claimant, we didn't have standing. So there's always a standing question floating around, but it might be that the standing test, the standing hurdle, if you like, to challenge whether or not a charity can be registered as a charity, is a much higher hurdle than the general hurdle.
So So when they say you don't have legal standing, they mean in this case. They don't mean as a group.
That's right.
You're not like you're no longer a practicing group. Like go away.
That's right. That's
Okay.
right.
Yeah.
It's
Okay,
always a sort of context-specific question.
Yeah. Okay. Because I did like whenever you see anything, like you saying you would like public enemy number one, you've made a lot of enemies because you've attacked the Conservative government and you've attacked the gender critical people and you've got lots of stuff going on. And so when anything comes out about Good Law Project or about you, even neutral, there's instant spin to say how this is your downfall. And the first I saw of it was gender critical people saying, Good Law Project no longer have standing, which means they'll never be able to do another trans court case again. And this is it. This is the final like straw on the camel's back or whatever. And then now hearing you just explain what standing is, that seems completely ridiculous.
It is completely ridiculous. But the thing about the law is, it's not really a momentum sport, right? If everyone on Twitter rose up in unison and said Good Law Project doesn't have standing, that wouldn't matter. The question would be, as a matter of law, does Good Law Project have standing? And the fact that everyone on Twitter agreed that we didn't would be completely irrelevant. That's kind of cheering and important to remember when you read stuff about me and about us and about our likely success. We are very, very careful about the cases we take, and you can see that in the extraordinary success rate we have, particularly given that we choose to fight in the most difficult of areas.
Yeah, I've seen that's a point that you've raised in the media a few times about your very good success rate. So at least for trans cases so far, it's 100% success, right?
It's 100% so far, yeah.
And as a wider thing, it's very high. It's no longer 100%, or?
It's very high. It's not 100%. We have lost some cases, but we've won some extraordinary landmark decisions in the highest courts in the country and in the highest courts in Europe. Nice. Difficult cases as well. We could find easy cases. We could bully our opponents, but those cases wouldn't be so impactful. And we really want to chase impact. There's no value in me having a 100% batting record. What I want is to have impact, and so we'll always chase impact.
So I guess like they're the current like major outstanding cases you have for trans stuff, and I guess there's lots of room to do more in the future. I know one other thing that you've done recently is over the whole mess with the EHRC. So for anyone who doesn't know, the EHRC is like the government's equality watchdog, I guess. They're the group who meant to be doing guidance and stuff based on the laws for all kinds of different human rights. And they've recently had a gender critical person installed into the top level who seems to have completely torn the organization apart. Like countless people are quitting. They've had loads of whistleblowers. Apparently people are crying at their desks. Morale is so low. Like Vice have done loads of leaks on them, and an absolute fucking disaster. It sounds like this person has, I don't know. There's this thing that I've been saying for years, which is transphobia rots your brain. And what I mean by that is, if you're a rational person and you're faced with a situation in a certain context, you would act in a certain way. And you would do that across the board, whatever the context was. And suddenly when it's trans people, you just can't. And I think a good, like an example of that would be when you see this kind of feminist point and you say, oh, well, if this happens, then that'll be bad for women. And you're like, oh, that's a similar pattern to what we see in race. If this happens, it'll be bad for people of color. If this happens, it'll be bad for gay people. And if this happens, oh, and it can't be bad for trans people because transphobia has rotted my brain and like the pattern no longer applies and I no longer can be rational here. And it just seems that at least some of the, I don't know what to say, alleged actions of the head of the EHRC now, or one of the commissioners, just seems to be completely off the rails, trying to change the guidance against the lawyers who work for them's like decisions and all of this kind of stuff. But I know that basically there was a big leak and the entire LGBT charity sector came out against them and has condemned them, and loads of the big important groups have cut ties with the EHRC completely. And I know that lots of groups, including all the LGBT groups, but lots of other legal groups have written to someone to try and get their status reviewed or something. So you were involved in that?
So the Equality and Human Rights Commission is supposed to be an independent sort of watchdog of human rights. And I mean, I think it's right to say that its new chair is gender critical. She's made some pretty extraordinary observations about the rights of the trans community. But more important even than that is the level of control to which the EHRC is subject, such that it's sort of almost a tool of government decision-making. And that control by government is inconsistent with it being an independent watchdog.
Yeah.
And so the status of the EHRC as a human rights institution, we think should be downgraded. We're aware from civil servants inside the Government Equalities Office the government is very, very worried about this.
Good.
And we've taken advice from one of the leading international practitioners on UN human rights institutions, and she is shocked by what we've put before her. I mean, in truth, the attitude of the EHRC to equalities is pretty mixed. It is not just trans people who feel betrayed by the EHRC. If you speak to disabled groups, if you speak to Muslim groups in particular, they are very, very unhappy with what the EHRC is doing. They would say that the EHRC has adopted a kind of hierarchy of human rights, and that some human rights are worth protecting and some human rights, well, they don't matter quite so much. So we don't really need to bother about those. And of course, the groups at the bottom of that hierarchy are the groups that sit furthest from the British establishment. Yeah. And that's absolutely anathema to what a human rights institution should do and should be. And we think that if the EHRC is downgraded, and we think there's a very real risk, indeed a likelihood of that happening, it will be a wake-up call to the government. It will be an international humiliation, really, for the United Kingdom's record as a respecter of human rights.
So, and that could be extra bad if it happens this year, as this year's the UK's got their Safe to Be Me, which is
safe to be me if you're white and cis and middle class.
Yeah, it's meant to be
not so safe to be me if you're anyone else.
Yeah, and it's meant to be their like conference for LGBT rights and stuff. And it's meant to be, like this international event. And the choosing Safe to Be Me after 6 years of attacking trans people for being them is pretty mad. But the fact this is coming then is going to bring extra attention to them being a disaster. I don't really know about what the best outcome of this. Well, I mean, the best outcome of this would be they replace all of the gender critical people who are too irrational to have a good view on anything here, and getting some experts on human rights again, and then the EHRC carries on being an A-star, whatever the rating is, group and fights for human rights. That's like the best outcome. But if the government's going to resist that and they need downgrading, then I guess that's just gonna have to be what happens.
Well, we want a proper human rights institution doing the very important work that a proper human rights institution does. But what we can't have is an organisation that is leading, or at least at the front line of the attack against the rights of trans people, pretending to be a human rights institution. That's the worst of all possible worlds. So it has to be one or the other. Either they are publicly recognised for what they are, which is really a tool of government policy making in this area, or they're a human rights institution. They can't be both.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, recently Liz Truss wrote to the commissioner saying, basically, chill out, you're showing all your cards and messing up my chance at being PM. I think
You paraphrase lightly.
yeah. So I feel like the main goal of the UK gender critical movement for now, like their main focus is this idea of banning trans women from women's spaces. Like that would be their dream, and that's what they say. They often say out loud, but then they'll deny they've said it out loud because they know that the public doesn't really like it, and it sounds as abhorrent as it is when you say it out loud. But it does seem to me that was something that the new people in charge in this group, and several of them by the sounds of it, actually were aiming for. I know they only have some limited power, but it just seems that ideally they would have come out with new guidance saying, anyone can ban trans women from anywhere, and it would have sort of set this precedent, and then they could challenge in court. That seems to be their first stage dream goal, and I'm trying to, like, that would be the gender critical dream, but I also want to make it clear that they absolutely wouldn't stop there, as we've seen in every other country that's ever done anything like this. But it does seem they just messed it up. It just seems to be done very badly, and that's a good thing. But it's still very worrying. I've been very stressed about this when it was, they've got this new guidance that still hasn't come out, and we don't know how bad it's going to be, and potentially they will just go all in, and she'll just say, right, you can ban trans women from the toilets, and then obviously you or some group would be able to challenge that.
Yeah, so it's on the list of things that we would go to the trans advisory group and ask, do you want us to challenge this? Because obviously it would be very important. It would have a profound effect on the lives of trans people. It would also have a profound effect on the lives of cis people, actually. Because I'm not quite sure what you do if you're a cis woman who doesn't like wearing pretty frocks and doesn't have glorious long blonde hair. Yes, I am looking at you, Katie. And who still wants to use women's toilets, right? You're going to have to carry papers with you. Is there going to be somebody at the door inspecting whether women who don't sit square within the sort of archetype of what a woman looks like are actually cis women? How is this actually going to work in practice? And is it actually going to be good for cis women? This is where the patriarchy and gender critical feminism butt up against one another, really. This is why those people on the Christian right, who are no friends of feminism, are so keen to support transphobic causes. It's because they know that it puts all women, be they cis or trans, back in their box. The lawyer who was behind the Bell decision said in the aftermath of the Court of Appeal decision, he let the cat out of the bag. He said, this is very bad for our case on Gillett competence. What he meant was that it's going to be, it makes it difficult for them to turn back the clock in relation to people being able to access abortions, which is what they want. These are not feminists. They do not want what feminists want, be they gender critical feminists or any other kind of feminists. Their worldview is anathema to feminism.
Absolutely. I mean, it seems mad sometimes talking to them where they, they'll say, oh, I'm a feminist, and I say, but look who is supporting you, and look who your allies are, and how extreme they are. Like even and it's always a bad sign when you're bringing up the Nazis or whatever, but even the people with the most extreme abhorrent views, they'll share all this gender critical stuff. They support it, and like none of these super pro patriarchy groups or these big religious organizations or these mad dictators and all of this stuff, like none of them are like, oh yeah, I hate women and I hate gay people and I love trans rights, because it just doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit in. But then not only can we just pattern match and see who's on what side of what, but also the actual laws that they're attacking. When you go for Gillett competence, trans people lose, absolutely, but most of the people who lose are cis women. Like that's the main, or cis girls even. That's the main target here. And it's the same with these other things. Like when it comes to, if they did do a bathroom bill, like North Carolina did one in 2016, where they just said you can only go to the toilet of your birth sex. And absolutely trans women lose out seriously badly here. But most of the people who lose out are cis women because they just outnumber us so, 300 plus to 1. And there are just some cis women who, I'm not saying, these are women who look like men or whatever that means, but there are some women who will get challenged by transphobic, misogynistic dickheads, and they'll say, you shouldn't be in here. And that isn't just a hypothetical. There are, I know people who this has happened to personally. Loads of my friends who are like gender non-conforming or whatever have been challenged, and I never have been challenged because it's not that gender criticals have this idea, they can detect who's trans or whatever. It's just garbage, and women will lose out as well as obviously all trans
you're
people.
also going to have a world, aren't you, in which trans men are forced to use women's toilets. So you're going to have men who have had bottom surgery, who are on testosterone, who look like men, who read as men, who are men, forced to use women's toilets.
Yeah,
how does that help cis women? How does that protect cis women from cis male rapists? How are they going to know whether the person before them who presents as a man is a trans man or a cis man? A trans man entitled to use or required to use the women's toilets, or a cis man who's not? I mean, it's as soon as you dig below the fearful rhetoric, as soon as you ask the question, well, what do you actually want? How is this actually going to be better? You stumble into all sorts of questions that are impossible to answer. The reality is, and this was actually what I said publicly after the AEA case, the Authentic Equity Alliance case, is that society has collectively to resolve these problems itself over time, by negotiation, by people who are experts in the field. And it really isn't the place for courts to come in and seek to upset those delicately negotiated compromises that balance the interests of everyone in society. I mean, the work that we do is very reactive. We don't think the courts are the right place to change trans rights. We think the courts are the place to protect trans rights.
It's mad situation. So we've gone a little bit over an hour, and I know that you were gonna review how much energy you had. I've got a couple more things that I can ask, but if you're running out of steam, then we can call it a day.
Happy to spend another few minutes.
Okay, cool. So I guess one of the things that as a trans person and talking to other trans people, it's good to see is groups like Good Law Project and hopefully others going out there and actually winning rights back when we've had them attacked. And like you say, it's largely reactive, but also it's good to know that there's a group who will act if something new happens. If it was going to be the case that they brought out this crappy guidance that that you would be able to challenge it. But I guess there are other things that it's hard to know. There are like one of the things recently that Good Law Project did was release this guidance on like schools and who can be in what school, because in the UK we still have sex segregated schooling in some places, not everywhere. And one school has recently announced, we're banning trans girls because we're a girls only school. And it's very difficult to know how that could ever change. Um, and I know that the law's a bit murky here, and I did see that you had mentioned you released the guidance, and then days later there was a ruling, and it's kind of like, well, is this guidance still exactly right? I don't know. What do you feel on that situation in particular? Like with this
Well,
guidance, and what could be done? Because I guess in order to do like a traditional law challenge, you need a trans girl who wants to go to the school, who has the parents to do it, and the time and energy to then challenge that. If not, they'll just say, oh, well, we'll steer clear of that, and then this discrimination just stands.
yeah, but it's also not a major issue, right?
No, it's not.
It's not an issue that, the number of trans girls wanting to go to girls' single-sex schools that won't allow them to go is not a huge number. And so it's not an issue that we would want to spend very scarce time and very scarce money fighting. Because most schools actually will want to do the right thing. The Girls' Day School Trust has a number of trans boys at it, and probably has a number of trans girls at it as well that it may or may not know about, and is generally pretty supportive. They just got some legal advice, and they didn't report it. They didn't report it very well. So we try and go where the real problems are. And one of the places where there's a real problem is that there is no guidance to help the tens of thousands of schools up and down the country understand their legal obligations in relation to trans people. And so we commissioned a piece of advice from a guy called Dan Squires QC, who's a leading equality lawyer, very, very widely respected, very, very independent. It's not a piece of advocacy. It contains some stuff that the gender criticals were very, very pleased to read. It contains some stuff that the gender criticals were very displeased to read. It wasn't intended as a piece of advocacy. It was intended as something to help schools and to help parents understand their rights. So, a couple of months ago, Good Law Project got involved because a school had said to a child who was in care, who was trans, that child could not go to that school because of them being trans. And we were approached by that child's foster mother, and we instructed lawyers, and we wrote to the school, and the school immediately changed their mind. And we got a very apologetic letter from the local authority, and everything was resolved. But that situation should not have arisen, probably wouldn't have arisen if the school had been in possession of guidance. Government should be producing guidance and releasing it. The Equalities and Human Rights Commission should be producing guidance and releasing it, but it hasn't. And so we thought there was space for us there to be useful.
Yeah, it's no, I think that is important because people message me all the time saying like, what is the law here? What can I do? And I'm like, I'm not a lawyer. Like, I absolutely cannot give you legal advice on anything. But it is, people make these decisions without knowing. And I know that not only that do people make bad decisions without realizing, people make good decisions and they're intimidated out of them. And I know there's been a few cases where a school has said, oh, we're going to teach about trans people at our school, and we've just made this new booklet that's going to teach about trans people, and then some gender critical group turns up with like £50,000 and a lawyer and like, we're going to sue you if you do this, and they just back down because they don't know what the law is, they don't know the rights, they don't want to be the center of a Daily Mail hate campaign. And it's it's going to take guidance and also like the confidence of schools to know that they can just ignore it. And so yeah, there's still a long way to go and all that kind of stuff. So it is good to see guidance coming out. And there's one more thing I wanted to mention, if you've got time. So recently there was two rulings back to back in Scotland, and one of them we already mentioned, which was Fair Play for Women against the census people, and they lost, which is good. But the other one was For Women Scot, who are another gender critical group. And well, I was just holding my tongue there. They are bad. And they recently did some other court case, and so in this case it was about So the Scottish government was imposing quotas on having women in positions of power in the government. So you can't have a situation where every single person in whatever role is a man, because that's usually a bad sign. And women get discriminated against. So the Scottish government were like, right, we're going to bring in a rule that says we've got to have a certain number of women in every role, and that includes trans women. And Form Women Scott challenged it, and it seemed to go. They almost seemed surprised in their announcement that it went completely in their favour, and the government said, well, yeah, it's just. I mean, it seemed to me they even maybe said it's just birth sex, excluding GRCs. So I don't. And I know you said you hadn't fully read this case yet, so perhaps you can't comment. But there's this interesting case with Scotland and England in that the powers devolve, but they kind of rely on each other, and these decisions can set precedents, or at least get it so other judges read those and make their decisions based on them. Do you think that this kind of ruling, which I'm hoping will get appealed and overturned, can have implications in the wider UK? And this, do you know much about this one in particular, or?
Yeah, I mean, I've only read the decision very briefly. It's not easy to understand the reasoning of the decision. And given that the party that lost was the Scottish government, which is adequately resourced and which is progressive when it comes to trans rights, I'd be very hopeful that they would appeal. But for sure, I mean, cases like this do create precedents. They also create noise. Their impact doesn't just sit in the legal domain. So this was the point that I made to Grace Lavery about the Bell case. I said that the centering of views that were scientific, medical crankery in a place of notional independence in the divisional court was a wrong that would take a generation to undo. I said that before the Court of Appeal overturned the decision of the divisional court. I stand by that. And I think, even if that second Scottish case in 2 days is overturned, it will nevertheless, because of how society is structured on this issue, because the establishment supports gender critical views and is really quite transphobic, it will have a positive impact for them, a negative impact for progressive politics. I mean, I don't want to be too gloomy about all of this, actually. I think in the medium and the long term, things will be good. They will be very good. And I don't say that as a matter of speculation. I say that because because of what consumer-facing businesses are doing. So in a world of short-term political horizons, nobody is really looking at what people will be thinking in 5 years or 10 years or 20 years, except for consumer brands. They are very heavily invested in understanding what the world will look like in 5 or 10 or 20 years. And they're not heavily invested because they care. They're heavily invested because if they get it wrong, their profitability will suffer. So they spend a lot of money making sure they get it right. And all of them are on the side of the trans community. None of them will, even with a very long stick indeed, be associated with transphobia, because they know what the future looks like, because they've spent a lot of money understanding it. So although if you look on Twitter, if you look in the Times, if you look in the Telegraph, if you look at pretty much anywhere in our revoltingly transphobic media in the UK, you will get depressed. If you actually look outside your window, beyond your computer screen, I think most people in the UK are decent, want to understand, struggle with what they read, basically pretty good and pretty empathetic. This isn't a community that is confined to cities, and it is a community that is understood by those who spent money on knowing to be a community that's in the kind of moral and political ascendancy. So there is lots of reason for positivity.
Yeah, and this is something that I tell a lot of people, because there's like you say, there's always crappy bad news. I mean, I think the Times did 3 anti-trans articles today, so it can seem incredibly overwhelming. But when we see like the actions of companies who blindly follow money and really do not give a fuck about trans people at all, like you say, they're heading in the right direction. But also all the polls, public opinion polls, whenever, like, they recently tried to spin an opinion poll, the BBC were trying to spin it as if it was like, oh, a contested issue, and they're like, only 55% or whatever it was people support the GRA reform and trans rights in general. And that was true, but then there was like only 20% oppose, and the rest of people are just like, I don't know. And I think that's, that's so damning for the gender critical position, that, I mean, that's a decisive victory for trans people, because 20 years ago that absolutely it would not have gone that way. We've made a big like win in terms of public perception, and that makes such a difference. And it moves a lot slower than, like, law's quite slow and compared to buzz on Twitter, but the law is a lot quicker in some ways than all of this stuff that will institutionally bubble up. They might get one win in court, which is bad for us, or you might get a win in court, which is good for us. But the fact that over half of people in the UK are like decidedly pro-trans rights means that their children will absorb that, and the organisations they work for will start getting policies that reflect that. And then the law will start reflect that more. And like in the recent ruling about the Scottish census that Fair Play for Women very thankfully paid for us, the judge said, oh, it's widely understood now that people can change sex, and they can do so even if they haven't got a gender recognition certificate. And like that's a big deal, and that's the kind of thing where he was sounded to me, at least, like he was citing this. Well, that's just what everyone thinks now. So yeah, I am feeling, long term I'm feeling positive. Super short term I'm feeling fine, and medium term I'm just a bit worried in case there is some kind of thing like the Bell case where they get something through and then it's 6 months to 2 years before it gets turned over, and that in that time it'll be stressful and it will absolutely affect trans people's lives. So I guess to all the audience watching, I'd say, like, yeah, I genuinely am feeling long-term positive, and like, public enemy number 1 here is feeling genuinely positive. So just try and take that away, because that is like a good thing. I think we should probably call it a day now. I feel like I could ask you loads more stuff. I wanted to ask about how gender critical people are just constantly threatening people with lawsuits for just describing them. Like I've had 4 different gender critical people threaten to sue me, including one who raised a load of money. But I don't know if we have time to go into that kind of stuff. And also my PC, sorry to everyone who was just watching, it lagged a little bit. We got all of the sound, so that's good. But there was a little stutter on the image, which is why I've just removed the tracker below. I have been watching it. I think we can just peek at it again. If I just click over here. So there's been quite a lot of pledges been going on while we've been watching, and it's up to 182,375, which I should have written down what it was on before that, but I think we've gone up quite a lot during this stream, so that's been really great, and I hope
that's really true. I'd love to come on again in 6 months or something like that, Katie, if you'd have me.
Oh, definitely.
It's really nice. The thing that I find most valuable actually is when people in the community tell me that my advocacy makes their lives better. It's just that it makes it possible for people to feel a little bit more optimistic about what's happening. That, at a really personal level, is what resonates. That's what makes it worthwhile for me.
Well, yeah, that's great. I mean, it genuinely does. I still feel like that the Bell case appeal was like, that was the one for me. That was such a good thing. It gave me so much more hope, because it just felt like maybe the whole court system isn't just rigged against us. And so, yeah, I guess I'll just say to everyone, like, I'm not actually I'm not like just doing a blind hype here of Good Law Project. I'm not affiliated with them, and if they did something shit, I hope everyone on Twitter knows I'd have absolutely no problems calling you out.
No one does, Katie. No one does.
I'll go for anyone, mate. Yeah, seriously, Joe, thanks for like stopping by and having a chat. And yeah, it's been really informative, and I hope everyone watching has learnt some things and feeling inspired and positive about the future for trans rights in the UK and around the world. So yeah, do you have any closing words before we go?
No.
Okay.
Unusually for me.
Right, we'll leave it at that with a final no. Bye, everyone.